Good afternoon. Yep, last lecture it seems. Everybody ready for, well, you have term break. I don't know whether this means anything or whether you get a bunch of exams afterwards, but at least I can stop preparing lectures. What I've prepared today is basically on humor, because we spent the whole term always looking at these humor pictures, but I never really took the time explaining how these humors are made. And so I now want to add this because it's a rather crucial part. It has a rather convoluted history, and we'll see in a moment how it works. So, the whole thing is, the whole task of embedding big data is much older than single cell. People have been talking about this since ever. I've just written back what our task is. We have data points which live in some high dimensional space. In our case, this was always the 30-dimensional PCA space, but it can be anything as long as we have some kind of metric or scalar product which allows us to judge the similarity between any two data points and hence get something like a distance between two data points. And I use X always today. I use X for the data points in this high dimensional space and Y for the two-dimensional data points that are on our chart. And our task is we have this high dimensional data and we somehow want to get a feeling for how does this data look. Is this just one big blob? Are there different clusters? Does it fall into several groups? Are these groups somehow connected or not? And I mean, this is what we always used the UMAP for. And if we have a look again at our UMAP that we always used, you see we see two big blobs, a few disconnected blobs, and we see that these two blobs are connected, that here's a circular structure. So these kinds of things which we can, I'm always wondering how to call them. In a certain way, it's something which is more than topology, but less than some differentiable manifold, because we want to have something that here we have many points together, here we have many points together. That's what we can see. We can see this filament connecting them. We can also see that this filament seems to have some curvature, but that's something we probably wouldn't want to put any trust in. The same thing here, this circular thing might mean something, which way around we go with circle and so on, we don't do it. So one is tempted to say we want to understand the topology, because part of the topology is, for example, that this blob is completely disconnected from that blob, but it's more than just topology, because we also see these changes in density. Like here, this very dense area of lots of points which are all quite similar in a big blob, and here rather big changes over with only few representative cells for each stage. So still looking for a good term how to call this mathematically, how to capture it, and I guess people always had it because the whole field now exists. Probably is more than 100 years and I couldn't find any good suggestion to explain what we're actually doing. This is why I deliberately here say that the chart that we want should represent the overall or maybe the detailed structure of this data cloud, which we can consider a manifold or maybe not, and putting all these things together. We want to find something two-dimensional that we can look at which represents our data. The whole thing is about making high-dimensional data visible to the human eye. And that can be by projecting in somehow in a 2 or 3-dimensional space. There's also ideas of maybe using interactive spaces, multiple spaces, maybe make pairs plots, first against second, second against third, first against third dimension, and using a mouse to allow you to highlight some points in some of these plots, and then you see where they are in the other thing. So people put a lot of thought into this simply because it's such a common issue where you take data and you try to find out what's going on in your data, and your data is simply too big to visualize it in a 2D scatter plot simply because it has more than 2 dimensions. And as you will see here in a moment from this timeline, people have been looking at this already early on, but in earnest at least since the 1950s. And the problem is we keep running into is, first of all, if it's not two-dimensional, then it isn't two-dimensional. Even if it were two-dimensional, it can't work. The surface of the Earth is a two-dimensional manifold, but we cannot easily depict it in 2D, because if you make a world map, it's always distorted in some way. It's even torn. Mathematicians would say if we try to make an atlas of the world map of the surface of a sphere, we need at least 2 charts. But in this chart idea for manifolds, we allow diffeomorphisms, which can arbitrarily distort the thing. And we don't want this here. We want to somehow keep a feeling for what's close to each other, what isn't, and to the relationship between points. As I said, more than just topology. And for this, we already run problems with a world map where, as you all know, you have distortions in areas, in angle, in lengths. You can be faithful to some of these and not to the others. And this is even for the manifold was two-dimensional. If you try to project a three-dimensional manifold down to two-dimension, you will quickly notice that this is more or less impossible, because things which were on top of each other now have to be besides each other. So it's intrinsically impossible to do this well. So we need to find a decent compromise, which is good enough for practical purposes. And what's good enough for practical purposes, of course, depends on what the practical purpose is. This is why there's little point in trying to get a clear mathematical definition on when a two-dimensional representation is good and when it isn't. But in any case, we will run into a couple of issues always. The first, as I just said, it's high dimensional simply is intrinsically difficult. Second, we will come back to this, what they call the crowding problem. If you have a point and the other points which are close to it, then in a two-dimensional area, only a small number of points can be close to that. In a high-dimensional space, much more points fit into a ball, because the volume of a ball goes exponentially with the dimension. So, in a way, if you define the neighborhood as a small area around some point, then the representation of this neighborhood won't fit into a neighborhood unless you make the neighborhoods very large, and then they fill completely your plot. And we will come back to this in a moment. Another issue is non-uniform density. If in our single cell data look at the distance from one cell to, say, the 20th nearest neighbor, that's always a good proxy for density, just asking how far do I have to go, but I have a ball which contains 20 cells, so I take the distance to the 20th nearest neighbor. That's a good approximation of 1 over the density. And if you plot this, we will notice that this varies by 2 orders of magnitudes. There's areas in our plot where the distance in PCA space is that much between a point and its 20th nearest neighbors, and there's areas where it's that much. If we try to preserve the scale, then our plot will become completely useless, because we will have some points which sit all on top of each other and others which hardly fit onto the screen. So the first thing we have to say goodbye to is the idea of preserving absolute distance scales. Maybe I open my sleevebook page again to bring this point home. You remember, I think I've shown you this before. If I take something like this thing here, this plot here, and you see this is now done that everything which has a Euclidean distance up to 6 is green, and you see here all these points are within a ball of radius 6, but here only half of the points fit into the radius, while the other half seems to be here, and that seems to be a new radius 6 ball all by itself. So this thing here is much more spread out than this thing here, and in that sense, we can say that here these two blobs which look the same represent two point clouds which in reality have very different densities, because the distance from here to here, we could try to measure it. We can quickly see that. You can also notice that the very fringes of this thing are also much further away than it seems. And that's by construction, because if we did it differently, we wouldn't be able to fit everything onto the page. And finally, even if there is a representation which is good according to our criterion, it might not be easy to find it, because we might come up with some criterion, maybe some score which tells us how good a representation is, and then we try to maximize the score. And if this optimization problem is not convex, we are unlikely to find the best optimization. So once we have defined what we want, which is hard enough, we have to find it, which is then maybe even harder. But in general, this is what people often do. We define some figure of merit which tells us how faithful the representation is. And typically this I might have a function which compares the distance in feature space to the distance on my chart, on my plot, and somehow gives a score about how well these two agree, and I calculate this score by adding, and I add this score over all points of pairs of points, and then I try to minimize this thing here. And in this function f, I can now try to encode all my desires about where the thing should be faithful and where it should cut corners in order to make trade-offs. Another possibility is to not write it as an optimization problem, but instead say we have all our points in the 2D space, and then we take each point and ask where should we move this point for a representation to become better. But you can easily see that these are essentially two different ways to formulate the same thing. Not quite, and we'll see the difference in a moment later today, but it can. But there's some similarity. What have people done so far? We've talked enough about principal component analysis. Devised already for the very first time in 1901, even though it took till the 1940s and this psychometrics thing till it became really popular. But it was always the obvious idea. Let's find a two-dimensional space into which we project the data such that we lose as little as possible. When people came up with this idea of making such a function, and they made the function simply by saying the ratio of the different distance in feature space and of the distance in real space shouldn't be too different, and they came up with score functions like the ratio of this divided by that shouldn't be larger than, and with this you get to these multi-dimensional scaling methods, which have multi-dimensional scaling, which typically use ideas like this here, where we can define something like a strain, where we say in the easiest case, what's the difference between the distance on our feature, on our embedding on our two-dimensional space and in actual feature space, and we try to minimize these squared distances, and they call this the stress, which we try to minimize. Then they realized that this doesn't really work well, because for all the reasons that we discussed. So their next idea was that they try to change the thing by first allowing some monotonically increasing function here to non-linear do this. Maybe we should allow a logarithmic correspondence between distances on our charts and real distance to gap all the large dimensions of due to uniform density. So that's what we here try, and of course with this f you can be arbitrarily close as long as the f is monotonic, so maybe in the end all you want to do is to keep the ranking of distances. That if we have, if point A is closer to point B in real space than to close C, this should also be like that on the chart, which would mean as f could be any function as long as it's monotonic. In practice, this also runs into difficulties because it's some kind of triangle inequality, and of course we will lose the triangle inequality in this whole projection business. So, That's how far I knew it. Now, by looking at the Wikipedia post, I tried that somebody tried to generalize it, somebody tried to make it super, and who knows what, but yeah, didn't work that greatly. What did people try next? A completely different idea was with self-organizing maps by Kohonen, who had a rather fancy idea. Let me see if I can quickly. Self-organizing map. Wasn't here a nice picture? He tried to turn the whole thing around and said, let's make a map. And each map here, the map is already given, and each point of the map should represent one area, one volume block of a feature space. And we want to do it such that somehow when we have a new data point or take a data point, we can ask where in this feature space is this thing best represented. And so each of these points here is associated with a point in feature space. And the points are supposed to be distributed well in feature space such that all the data points, when you all assign each data point to the closest feature space point, to the closest of these pixel points, then each pixel point should represent about the same number of the whole data, and also two pixels which are next to each other here should represent similar points. So Kohonen came up with some idea of saying as I said, each of these things is associated with a vector in feature space, and the vectors of neighboring ones should have a small high cosine similarity, and somehow he spreads them out. And I think without going into the details, this plot here maybe represents it best. Imagine the small red rectangles are the actual data points, and the grid is the grid which we put as our map, and then somehow the grid is pulled to the 3 points so that each third of a map represents, or each quarter of a map represents a different area of a feature space. The idea of these things, as you can see, is that the area on the map roughly tells you what area in feature space it represents. And yeah.
So just to understand, you always start from a grid, right? More complex.
Exactly. I think they like to start with a hexagonal grid because the neighborhood is a bit more flexible. But you start from a grid, and you have some clever way where you always take a data point, find its best matching pixel, and then we move the vector for this pixel a bit closer to the data point and do the same for all its neighbors. And that in the end gives rise to this. This is a completely different idea, because instead of moving pixels, moving points around on our chart, the points on the chart stay fixed, but the inverse mapping of which part of a feature space they represent are different. People were very excited about this back when it came out, because it felt like a really clever new idea to do that. Also because the way how Kohonen formulated it sounded a bit like neuronal networks, and neuronal networks, as I told you last time, have a habit of always everybody getting excited about them for 5 years, then forgetting about them for 15 years, and so on. The AI community calls this the AI winters, always the time when a whole generation of new students is no longer interested in it, and then after a while somebody gives it a new try. And Kohonen started one of the new excitement rounds again. But in the end, people moved on. Here they try to do with nonlinear MDS. I think that's the same as what I've just mentioned about trying to make this monotonic F function. And then they came to a new idea called stochastic neighborhood embedding, or SNE, which I will explain in more detail in a moment. And its improved variant, the T-distributed SNE. In between, there's the Laplacian eigenmaps, which I added especially because we've already sort of done them imagine, remember our neighborhood graph that we used last time for the diffusion maps, and then we took the Laplacian of this by subtracting the identity and took the eigenvalues of it in eigenvectors, and then it turns out that maybe just taking the eigenvectors for the two largest eigenvalues, they actually already give you a two-dimensional representation where similar points sit close to each other. So don't want to get into the details, but if you want to try it, you can go back to our code of last time and simply plot the eigenvector of the first versus, or actually the second versus the third eigenvector, because the first one is always constant, and color them by our usual colors, which we always use for our different Leiden clusters, and then you can see that you already see the rough structure. So it doesn't work that greatly, but this is one thing that people used a lot, and then the SNE people figured out what was wrong with their thing, and came up with an improvement which they called T-SNE, and this was what everybody used, and especially in the single cell field. People very much liked this T-SNE because it came out just about in the same year when the first single cell experiments were, no, that was 2012, 15, I think, the first single cell experiments. And then 10 years later came the UMAP, and everybody switched from T-SNE to UMAP because UMAP is so much better than T-SNE. Actually, it isn't. In reality, it turns out that T-SNE and UMAP are much more similar than the UMAP authors are willing to admit. And that's an interesting story by itself, which is why I decided to start with SNE to tell you the whole story, because it has some interesting math and also some interesting lessons about how research progress happens in applied math. So here, I wrote a bit of text, but actually I just wanted to tell you this. So SNE came out of a group of George Hinton. You know, I never knew much about the history of all this field until recently. I've been starting to read it, and now after Hinton got his Nobel Prize, I keep reading his name and realize actually this guy has done quite a lot. So that seems to be also from him. And yeah, even though he gobbled up one of our physicists' Nobel Prizes, let's accept that. And so his idea was the following, that, or don't know whether it was his or one of the other two authors, but what they said is that maybe the problem with the multidimensional scaling, why it never worked well, is that it tried to treat all distance the same. You remember, we somehow come up with this cost function f, which for everything compares it, and whenever they disagree, it gives a penalty. And which means you can make this f such that you get a huge penalty if 2 points which are very far in feature space are halfway close in chart space, but in the end representing the feature faithfully all over the whole scale of this of our data maybe is simply ask too much. In the end, what we really are interested is, if two data points are very similar, we want to see that by them ending up at similar points in our plot. And if they are not similar, if they're very different, they shouldn't end up next to each other. So maybe a good objective might be that we say all we want is to preserve neighborhood, so that we can immediately see about two data points, are they similar or not? So we binarize the distance. We decide upon a certain distance, say this is called the neighborhood, and everything here we call neighbors, and everything further out we call not neighbors. And we forget about all this definition, about all distinguishing between medium distance and very distance points. Once they are so far apart from each other that we wouldn't call them neighbors anymore, we say they can be anywhere on the chart, like rather close, rather far, as long as they don't end up sitting right next to each other. So this is the fundamental idea. We only want to preserve neighborhood, but once 2 points are no longer neighbors, all we care about is that we don't end up next to each other on the plot. Make sense? And so here, preserve neighborhood is what I've written here. But of course, if we make a hard cut and saying, well, the first 20 points are neighbors and the remaining is not, maybe this will mess up everything a bit. Actually, it won't, as we will see in a moment later, but back then we thought it might, and so we decided that maybe this idea of neighborhood we should make a bit fuzzy. There was this idea of fuzzy logic, which actually was already out of fashion at that time, but they remembered it, and in this fuzzy logic, instead of using Boolean logic where you say yes, it's a neighbor, or no, it's not a neighbor, in the gray zone cases you give values between 0 and 1. And so they had this sort of obvious idea, let's take a Gaussian kernel. And if we have points which are distributed like this, and we have this point here when we say everything under this kernel is the neighbor, and this thing is definitely a neighbor, and this is 50-50 a neighbor, and this is rather not a neighbor. And in that way, we have some kind of probability score which tells us for any 2 points whether they should be considered neighbors or not. They call it a probability. I find it a bit hard to wrap my head around what this means about whether it's a probability. We don't choose. It's more a score about how much they are neighbors. But they treat it like probability because it allows them to use some useful mathematics. And then they do, so we do use this in the feature space to define what they consider neighbors. And for each pair of points, they get a neighborhood score or neighborhood probability, which is a value between 0 and 1, which is taken from such a Gaussian. And on our chart, we do the same. 2 points on the chart are also considered neighbors if they sit close to each other, and the neighborhood score is calculated with a Gaussian kernel. And with this, our idea now comes out to we want to find an assignment of points on the chart, a positioning of the points on the charts, such that the neighborhood scores or neighborhood probabilities for all the pairs of points on the chart are similar to how they are on the feature space. And that now makes our neighborhood preserving, because it means whether the distance is like this or this doesn't matter, as long as in the feature space it again doesn't end up somewhere under the bulk of this kernel. So what we do is, as we said, for any pair of points, we define a neighborhood probability which is proportional to a Gaussian, like this thing here. And for this, we have to come up with a neighborhood size, which I call here the kernel with sigma f, which is how big the neighborhood is in the feature space. And we do the same on the chart, and there, of course, we have a sigma e for size of neighborhood in the embedding space. And so how does this now work in details? We first say, okay, to judge whether j is a neighbor of I, they use here this thing xj minus xi squared over 2 sigma, so the usual Gaussian. I omitted the normalization here because we'll get it in a moment anyway. And in order to deal with non-uniformity of the density, what I said in the beginning, that in some areas the points are very close and others they are very far, we use an adaptive kernel width. We always make the kernel such that say 20 points are under the bulk of this kernel. We measure it, now of course j and I might have slightly different densities, so this here uses the sigma I, so the density around xi as kernel, as denominator as kernel width. And this is why I wrote it here in this asymmetric way. The neighborhood score that j has as a neighbor of I, and it's not the same as the neighborhood score that I has as a kernel of j, because they might have different kernel widths. And in order to make these probabilities, we normalize them, so that if we choose an index, a central cell I, we can say for every other cell where it is a neighbor with a probability p, such that overall the probabilities all add up to 1, so that you get in the end Well, on expectation, you would get one neighbor, but we want something like 20 neighbors. So you can imagine that there is some number 20 or so inside, but it's all a bit hand-wavy. The more I read about it, the less it makes sense to me to really call this a probability. You'll see in a moment why we like to call it a probability. The first thing that they wanted to do is how do we choose the sigma I? And where they came up with a rather involved thing, they said, let's look at the entropy of these probabilities. And we want the entropy to be log 2 of p, or some value. The idea behind this might be that you want to get a high entropy, probabilities have to be different. If you have zero entropy, all the probabilities would be the same. When you had maximum entropy, if they all are the same, and that would correspond to infinite kernel width. And if you make it such that one cell gets neighborhood probability 1 and the others get 0, then you get the minimal entropy. And that would be the other thing. And they move this so that the kernel entropy becomes this value. And it then turns out that with some hand-waving arguments, you can then argue that this P is actually the average number of neighbors that we should get. The exact explanation why this would be is a bit peculiar, because as I said, this here is, if we normalize it, there should only be one neighbor, but now there is p neighbors, but in practice we just set p to 30 or something like this. We call it the perplexity, and then we move here, and then we just try to solve for sigma I by simply trying different values for sigma I, making a binary search. If the entropy is too big, we make it smaller, and vice versa, until we find a value of sigma I so that the perplexity is rather p.
I could imagine that this will become clear with time, but I'm very concerned about this p sub j given I, in the sense that doesn't this scale with n to the n for n points? For each of the endpoints?
Yes, it will come down. It will become clear two things later when we strangely suddenly normalize again to get rid of this issue. Okay. But in any case, we now have this. We have defined this somehow, and now we symmetrize the probabilities because we, as before, all the neighborhoods can be asymmetric, and because they can have different kernel widths, and that will mess up our downstream math. So we simply take the average between the two. And just to counter the problem that he just mentioned, we divide by the number of cells here. Which is weird because we normalize the thing and now we renormalize them according to a different logic. And now, when we can do the same, of course, on the embedding space, once we have defined points on the embedding space, as found a representing point for each data point in our two-dimensional chart, then of course we can calculate neighborhood there as well. But there we want the density of points to not vary too much, so that we make effective stuff of our plotting surface. So instead of choosing sigma with some strange thing, we just set it to 1, or to sigma e, to whatever constant we like. And then, of course, this thing will have the same value no matter whether you have j, if you swap j and I, so we don't need to symmetrize anymore. And in this way, we get a new set of probabilities, if you want to call them probabilities, which we call qij. And now we want to know how similar the probabilities pij and the probabilities qij's are. And usually, when statisticians want to judge how similar one probability distribution is to another one, or how well one probability distribution approximates another one, they use something called the Kullback-Leibert divergence. This is some kind of entropy which is crossing. You see, it's Pij log Pij, that would be the usual entropy of Pij, minus Pij log Qij is, the machine learning people like to call this a cross entropy, because it's sort of the information content of Q evaluated with the expected information content of Q following the probability distribution of P. And they say they want to minimize this divergence, which means they want to minimize this thing. Now notice that Pij is fixed, because these probabilities we calculate once at the beginning, but our data is fixed, so these don't change, but the Qij, they change when we move our points around on the feature space. So in the end, we have this cost function, and we want to minimize this, and we do this by gradient descent. Gradient descent means this Q is after all these Q's. Why have I, oh, sorry, I used here I used Q double. This is the unnormalized P. I should have called it P tilde or something, because Q is the one for the data space. But we now have on the data space, we have of course something like Qij is X minus, and then Xi minus Xj squared plus Yi minus Yj squared, where these are simply the X and Y coordinates of the points on our plotting scale, and this over 2 sigma squared. So as you can see, this is Qij, and Qij appears here in this logarithm. So if we sum up this thing now over all our pairs of things and take the logarithm of this thing, then we get the cost function plus some constant, which I've ignored now in the minus here. Const minus this thing. So I can calculate the derivative of this C with respect to every single xi and xj and yi. Yeah.
This turns out the cost function. I see that it involves the coordinates within the event.
Yeah.
But I thought previously it was weighted by the probabilities in the original space.
Yes, because I forgot it. Thanks.
Outside of the logarithm? Or
In, right. Oh, right, you're right. The logarithm is, it's inside the logarithm, and the logarithm simply cancels with this exponential, and then we have here our Pij, sum over them, and have here our minus log. Sorry for the chaos. Exactly. That's how it is. And this, of course, you can see this is easy to calculate the derivative with respect to each x and each y, and this allows us to know how we have to move the points in order to decrease this thing. An interesting aspect for how many physicists are present today? Nobody? Pity. An interesting aspect here is you can also consider this gradient as a force. So in physics, we have this idea of potentials and forces. So for example, if you have a lot of points which all gravitate, so they all attract each other, then you can calculate the total potential energy of this thing by summing up all these points here, and na, was sollen wir jetzt machen? X minus xj. So, xi, mi. So this is the potential of these point masses, m1, m2, m3, which are at the positions x1, x2, x3. And you can imagine if they are now big blobs, sufficiently big masses, they produce what we call a potential, which basically means if we have a small test particle with a mass m, which is much smaller than the mass of these involved things, then the potential energy of this point in the gravitational field produced by these things would be given by this formula, or is given by this formula. And if I want to know in which direction this thing gets pulled, I take the gradient of this thing, because you see this is a vector, this is a scalar field in space. So I can take the gradient of u and can get the vector f is the gradient of this thing, and the gradient of this thing will tell me in which direction this particle moves. And I've forgotten the mass of a particle because I'm now doing physics. But I can also use the potential for these things. This is now assuming that these things are fixed. But now I forget about my particle and let them and imagine these can all move. So they themselves will feel the attraction of all the others and move towards them. And one way to calculate this is to take Newton's law and say this point here gets attracted to that one, that one, that one, that one, that one. So I have to add up the vectors in all these directions and see how it moves, or at least not how it moves, but how it gets, which force it experiences, and hence how it gets accelerated. But and this will then reduce u, and we can see, because in physics, everything tends to potential energy. This is the whole point of potential energy, that after a time step, the potential energy might be lower because it might move towards that. So we always say the change in position is also given by the gradient. Because if I consider this the test mass, for the same reason as we've just discussed, its change in time, so its acceleration or the force it's experienced, is given by the potential that it has in the field of all the others. And hence it moves in that direction. And what it can do, I can consider this thing here as if I can consider this potential in two ways. I can consider it as a function of a position x to tell me the potential energy that I have if a point would sit there, or I can consider it as a function of all the positions of all these big masses, and then I can take the gradient with respect to all the positions of the big masses, which would me tell for each of the big masses in which direction it is pulled. And this is what we do here. What we have calculated here, we want to calculate how all these points move to see where the point y on the plotting surface moves. We take the gradient of the cost function to that. So our cost function is exactly the same thing as a potential energy or a potential field is in classical theoretical physics, which is now a pity that no physicists are here today, because you spent the whole first half of theoretical physics, one lecture in the third term and the second year to discuss these things, and here they reappear. But for this means that these points, that of course the force, that the direction of this thing is the sum of the forces here, and you can now see here I calculated the derivative. And of course, the derivative on point I points in the direction to point J, from I to J, and the strength of a force depends on how much these two things disagree from each other, which is what we wanted. And in that way, we can imagine that if we now do a gradient descent, we go that way. So this one and the same mathematical operation can be interpreted in two ways. We can say we are machine learning people. We are used to think about about loss functions or cost functions and do a gradient descent to lower the loss. And this is why we calculate the gradient here. Or we can say we are physicists and we imagine that each of these y's is a particle, and the particles either repulse or attract each other. They will attract each other if the distance or the neighborhood probability in the embedding is lower than the neighborhood probability in feature space, because when they are too far from each other, they will restrict each other, and if it's the other way around, this thing changes sign, and they will experience a repulsive force. And in that way, we can consider this as a physical dynamic thing where we imagine these points all moving according to the forces they experience from all the other points.
I'm a bit confused by the yi minus yj. So of course, I guess that's an outer norm of that vector. So as I understand it, the gradient here increases as the distance between point I and point j in the original space.
If you now tell me that the sign is wrong, then probably it is. I haven't.
Instead of a sign, that it should be a ratio instead of a product. So I would thought yi and yj get further apart, then potentially.
No, the point is if this is 0, so then of course there is no reason to move them.
But what about yi minus yj? If they're very far apart, then should the gradient be big?
Yes. Probably they shouldn't. Maybe it would be better to make the gradient update only in the direction of this, but not proportional to the distance. I also wondered about this when I tried to write it up yesterday. And the way is, this is simply how the math comes out. Starting from there, so if you start from their story of this being probability of neighborhood for which we want to minimize the Kullback-Leibler divergence between the two probability distributions, then this comes out stringently. If you simply say, I want to get as close as possible to this one, you want to get these things quickly to 0, then it might be, then you might say, let's remove that thing and simply replace it by a unit vector in the direction of yi minus yj. So that we don't have this, especially we now have the unphysical thing that the attraction is stronger when we are far apart from each other, but we're not doing physics. So maybe that's actually a good thing, because if we are far apart from each other, then might have to move a lot. Well, if we are close, it might only be a small adjustment. So it's maybe not so bad that the direction depends on that. So we can also look at this and ask, are these dynamics which are likely to give us the result we want if we integrate them up? And of course, you can also start from writing down these dynamics and then integrate this up by finding the cost function which has this gradient, and checking whether, and then inspecting it to see whether the minimum, the analytically expected minimum of the whole thing is what you would like. Which I think is a bit, we will now see that different researchers have approached the whole thing from very different areas. And depending on it, you can run it in order to solve this embedding problem, you can feed your intuition with what you are familiar with. A physicist might think about this way. A machine learning guy thinks about, let's make a cost function and calculate its gradient. Other people might rather think about, let's think about which kind of movement we want to do and integrate this up. So depending on from which corner of the math we come, we might have very different ideas of what we do, but interestingly, we will probably always end up by a rather similar thing, namely some gradient of some function which we want to follow. So what was here? Now, one problem that we have here is this gradient. If we want to calculate the cost function, you see it has here I've got nonsense here. This should say I smaller j, because this is a double sum over all pairs I and j. And if you write it, you can think about whether you count the pair ij and the pair ji separately or not. We made it symmetric, so it is only a factor 2, which, yeah, nobody cares about in an optimization. Because it doesn't change the position of the minimizer. So in that sense, In that sense, we have this double sum here, and if we want to calculate the gradient, then in order to calculate the movement of one particle, we have to calculate the force it experiences from every other point. So from n minus 1 different points, and we have to do this for n points, so we have to make a calculation which runs quadratic in the number of points. And that sounds annoying and slow, because in every gradient update step we have to do this quadratic, this double loop over all of them. Yeah.
But isn't the computation of Pij much more expensive than double? I thought the Pij is still exponential.
Yes, but remember the Pij are for the...
Sorry, the Qij, right? Whatever one changes as we...
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. If we have a Qij, or we want the Y. Remember, we don't calculate the Qijs. We are given the Pijs, the neighborhood probabilities in feature space, and we calculate this once at the beginning, before we start our optimization. And then we do our gradient here. And in this gradient, for each gradient step, we have to calculate for each point where it should move. And so we get the gradient of this thing. And the gradient of this thing, of course, has internally this Qij, because if you insert for Qij the formula, then you get this thing here. So the Qij basically vanished because we insert our formula, our kernel for the Qij, and then we get that part, and with this we then get this exactly the expression we see here. And to calculate this expression requires running this sum here, and we have, which goes over all n particles, or n minus 1 particles. Now, as you know, I'm a physicist, so I keep saying particles instead of data points. But its data point is what I mean. And we have to, for each of the n particles, to update their position, we have to calculate forces to n minus 1 other particles. So this runs quadratic. And that makes the whole thing rather slow, and that made people rather unhappy. And interestingly enough, when a couple of physicists came along and said, we know this problem. Whenever we want to calculate galaxies, have you ever seen the galaxy formation simulation? Let's see if I find... you ever seen these kinds of simulations here? Each point here, this is a few million points which they simulate in three-dimensional space, and they calculate the attraction of every point to every other point in order to calculate the gradient, and then they see how this thing here moves. And we start off with just a random movement in a big cloud, and now we want to see whether the whole thing will settle in the end in something like a spiral galaxy. And let's see if it does that. I now clicked on a random link, but I imagine there was a simulation to show this. Let's jump ahead a bit. Here is, now you see the spiral galaxy that happened. And here you see a look from above. So we look from the side on it. Okay, so how did the physicists do that? They have maybe many millions of points, and then they have to do for every single time step in this imagination n squared calculations. Now, this problem, of course, has been discussed in astrophysics since ever, because as soon as computers came out, people tried to simulate this, because I wanted to know why in astrophysics everything is disc-shaped and not round. Planetary systems, accretion disks, galaxies, and so on. And Barnes and Hutz had a clever idea. They essentially said, well, we can split our area, we can make a tree where we split first our whole simulation area here, you see, in 9 big squares. In each of a square we can subdivide into 4 squares, and these again into 4 squares, and so on. And then this is a big quad tree, where, or if you do it in 3D, it will be an octree, where every big square will have 4 smaller child squares. And at the end, you have your individual points. And what you can now do is, remember a fundamental theorem from physics is, we form away the attraction of these 3 points here, is the gravitational pull of these 3 points acting on this test mass is the same as if you were to replace them with a single particle of the sum of the mass at the center of mass. We are outside a gravitational system when you can replace the whole system by a point mass as its center of mass. And this still works here for this kind of math once you do that. So what you can do if you are calculating for each of these squares, the small, the medium-sized, and the large squares, we calculated where the center of mass of all the masses in the square are, and what the sum of the mass is. And hence, if I'm now here and want to calculate, say, the attraction on this point, then I don't have to take all these points individually. I take this whole big square for which I have already pre-calculated the center of mass and use this for all the points here. Only if I want to calculate the attraction of a point here, which is in this square, then I can't use this square. But I can still use these 3 smaller squares. So in that way, I can dramatically reduce the whole thing, because for every point, I always take a whole blob of a large part of a thing when running that. And this is how the simulations are possible. And of course, the moment the first astrophysicists saw the T-SNE algorithm, he said, our algorithm works for that. And suddenly T-SNE got by several orders of magnitude faster, which I think impressed the machine learning people, that the physicists still have some tricks up their sleeve. But we will later see that there is 2 other ways to solve this, and we'll come to this in a moment, which I call the, one is the stochastic gradient descent. Instead of taking a point and calculating the attraction from all the other points, it might be sufficient to just take a random sample of 50 points and only calculate the attraction of the force of these 50 points. If they're evenly spread out, randomly sampled, then this might have over a long time the same effect as as calculating each point separately. And in a way, this is also what we've already talked about last time when we talked about stochastic gradient descent, where we also calculate a gradient using only a few randomly picked amount of data points and follow them and hope that over time we get the correct gradient, simply because we always add up parts of the gradient calculated from different points. Specifically here, one thing we can do, and that we will do, that the humor people do, so this is why I mentioned it already now, we might say for the far away points again, instead of finding the center of mass, we just pick only 1% of all the far away point and calculate the force to them and multiply by 100 to scale it up to what we originally had, because whether we take the actual center of mass of all the other points or just the center of mass of a random subsample of a small number of them will in expectation pull us in the same direction. We call this the repulsive sampling. No, shouldn't call it a repulsive sampling. That is a word for that. I always want to say rejection sampling, but that's something else. But in any case, for those which are far away, we can use individual points. We can just replace them by some sample, and that's another way of getting rid of this quadratic scaling. Now, the SNE algorithm didn't really took off because in practice it didn't work that well. And the reason, as people realized, is you have this kernel here in your high-dimensional space, and you try to put all the points which are in this kernel under the corresponding kernel on the low-dimensional space. But in the low-dimensional space, you have much less area, because this area only scales with the square of a kernel width, and this area scales with the div power of a kernel width. So if you try to put all the points in here, they will get too close and just sit all on top of each other, and you can't see anything anymore. You should give them a little bit more space to get out here in the tails. And here is the problem, because the tails go down exponentially, which means we get a really large penalty as soon as the point gets a bit into the tails. We might be better off by having a probability distribution which has fatter tails, which means it falls off less than exponentially far away from the center. This is called, in statistics, we call this a fat-tailed distribution, or a distribution with excess kurtosis. And the standard example of such a distribution is student's t-distribution, which you know from student's t-test. There, in order to take care of the uncertainty in estimating the sample standard deviation, you have to make the tails fatter than they are in the normal distribution. That was Gossam's or Student's big idea when he introduced Student's t-test. So a couple of years later, we decided maybe we should do it that way. In the high-dimensional space, we keep our Gaussian kernel, but in the low-dimensional space, we use a t-distributed kernel which has fatter tails. When we tried around a bit which t-distribution it is, because you remember there's a t-distribution with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees of freedom, with any kind of degrees of freedom, and with fewer degrees of freedom, the fatter the tails. After some trying around, we realized we actually need to get the tails as fat as we go. So we decided to use the fattest of all the student t-distribution, the one with 1 degree of freedom. And students' t-distribution, you might remember, has this rather ugly probability density function, which looks always very intimidating. But if we now set in for nu the degrees of freedom a 1, the whole thing becomes really simple, because then you're simply left with this here, 1 over 1 plus x squared, and you have a 1 over pi to normalize it. So this means our qij, instead of having here our exponential kernel, we now use this thing here as a kernel. You know, I omitted the pi because it gets cancels out anyway. With here the normalization, and if we then put this, then we get a changed gradient, because now the derivative, of course, looks different. And something that happens in this changed gradient, as you already noticed, so this is here a division, we somehow divide this thing by the squared standard, which might make turns around what we had before. Now the force won't increase with increasing distance, but it actually rather seems to decrease if I read this right. So now, of course, so far we always looked at UMAPs. You might now wonder, how does t-SNE look different from UMAP? So I reran our example data and recalculated the UMAP, this usual UMAP that you've seen a lot, but this time I use ScanPy instead of Sera. And ScanPy is the Python equivalent to Sera for R, and ScanPy seems to run its UMAP with somewhat different default parameters. So the UMAP that I got out here from ScanPy looks like this. So you can see here this circle is not that well visible anymore. And this little blob thing here also got changed a bit the shape. But so you can see this, depending on what parameters you set, UMAPs can give you quite different looking things. And here you now see what t-SNE gives you. And in the end, I don't think the difference is that great between UMAP and t-SNE. If I put them next to each other, you still see here roughly the same shape. The main point is that the UMAP points are much closer, and the UMAP leaves bigger gaps between the points, while t-SNE always moves everything fast and leaves little white space between the things. And that made people terribly happy when the humor paper came out. And they said, this is much nicer, it shows much nicer the global structure because it shows clearer separation between the different things. If you use our sleepwalk tool to look at this, you might get a suspicion that this is a bit an illusion because in reality they are close. So maybe the t-SNE has a point there by putting little white space. But still, it's easier to find something in there. It gives you the illusion of order. So that's why everybody switched from t-SNE to UMAP. And there came out this UMAP paper, which claimed that the UMAP thing allows us to show global structure, which t-SNE cannot do, because t-SNE only gets the neighborhood right, while this thing gets global structure right. And in order to explain why their thing should be such better in reproducing global structures, they took really deep math. So who are the advanced mathematicians here? So obviously, in order to talk about this, let's start with category theory. This of course had the effect that everybody stopped reading the paper once the category turned up, especially one of these very annoying opposing functors, which nobody can ever wrap their head around what they mean. And you wonder, what the hell does this do? Here, this thing from this category, which somehow is to the category top, and there's even a co-limit. So yes, everybody was very impressed that all this advanced category theory and all this advanced topology can give now something as practical as UMAP. After bringing us through their very idiosyncratic access to category theory, because obviously these are category theorists who educated themselves about differential geometry. So they explain manifold from their category theorists' viewpoint. They give us a primer on differential theory, which is maybe not the viewpoint that most readers would like. When they come up and say that the problem with category, with all these high dimensional spaces is actually the following: the dimensionality changes, because in a manifold, in differential geometry sense, you assume that everywhere in the manifold the charts have the same dimension. But what if in some areas the dimension is much smaller than elsewhere? Maybe we have something which spreads out in this blob, and here it's in the surface. And maybe there is still a little bit of fuzziness which brings it, which moves in all the dimensions, but as we've seen in PCA, we might not do it. So how do we connect different manifolds of different dimensions? A good idea is, in general, if you have some two-dimensional thing and you want to understand it, a classical thing is triangulation. You split it into triangles. Engineers love that because triangles are nice and stiff, and so you can always triangulate everything by splitting it up in lots of small triangles. Most people might use squares, but there's the argument to be made that triangles are better than squares because they are sort of more simple, because they have one corner less. And if you want to do the same in 3, 4, 5, 6 dimensional, then you need the equivalent of triangles in higher dimensions. This means we need the geometric shape in the polyhedron of the respective dimension which we are in. What was the name? We have polygons, polyhedrons, and what was the hyperpolyhedrons? People have some word for this, for an n-dimensional polyhedron. Polytope is what they call it, right? A polytope is an n-dimensional figure. And the simplest polytope is, of course, the one which has the smallest number of edges without falling down. So if you're in 5-dimensional space, you need at least 6 corners Because if you have only 5 corners, then of course you can find a 4-dimensional hyperspace in which they sit. So you always need, for an n-dimensional thing, you need at least n plus 1 points in order to make a polytope which really has volume in that thing. And to get the simplest one, you just take the convex hull of this thing. And this is called a simplex. So a 2-dimensional simplex has 3 points, and the convex hull of these 3 points is, of course, the triangle. And with 3 dimension, it's a tetrahedron. And in 4 dimensions, it's well, whatever a 4-dimensional tetrahedron looks like. And in general, we call this a simplex. An n-dimensional simplex is this thing if you just take n plus 1 points and take the convex hull. And so they said, this is what we have to do. We have to try to split our manifold into lots of simplexes and use always the simplex of the appropriate dimension. And then we have to connect these simplexes of different dimensions to get something that the differential geometrists or topologists call a simplical complex. And at that point, every reader was really confused and gave up and was very impressed. Me too. Somebody else then read it with with a bit more patience and found this thing here. So we use manifold as to patch together a local simplical set representation of the appropriate dimensionality to construct a topological. And then after you've worked all your stuff through, I don't know, 12 pages, you come to this great sentence. We note that in this specific case, we restrict attention to comparisons of a one skeleton, which is restricted to simplex of 1 dimension. A 1-dimensional simplex is just a line connecting 2 points. And if you want to deconstruct a complicated data code in a 1-dimensional in one skeleton, you connect the data points by lines, and because it's local, you only connect the closed data points by lines. So we end up with a neighborhood graph. So they brought us through a wild ride of category theory and advanced thing to end up saying, yeah, after all this excursus, actually we're just working with a neighborhood graph as does everybody else. So what do we do with this? So after this story, I thought I owe it to you to also take you through this wild ride before I say, yeah, there's nothing new, it's just a neighborhood graph. And now I tell you what we did with the neighborhood graph. This goes very much to this paper. You might know Fred Hambrecht, who's here a physicist, and Sebastian Damrich was a PhD student of his, or later postdoc, and they wrote this brilliant little paper in which they basically say, on top of all this unnecessary detour, the UMAP implementation, the software that we authors have published, actually does not do at all what the paper says. Because they made a crucial implementation mistake, and if you fix the implementation mistake so that the software does what the paper claims, the UMAPs don't look nice anymore. So the real reason why the UMAPs look better than T-SNEs is not that they had some clever idea of simplical complexes, but that actually in implementing this, they made this tiny little mistake, which obviously was exactly the point where you should detour from logic and do something else. Now I hope I still have enough time to show you this masterpiece. So UMAP starts with a directed K and N graph, as does everybody. And in this directed graph, they now have this idea of setting weights to the graph. And the weight should be sort of exponentially fall off with a distance. And in order to again get this uniformity that it looks the same in low dimensional, in low density and high density regions, they had the idea to normalize the whole thing by the distance to the very nearest, to the first nearest neighbor. So if you read this, if you pull this out of exponential e to the minus rho over sigma, it's just a scaling factor which makes sure that all the distances have the same scale. namely such a scale that the distance to the lowest thing gets weight 1 and the further ones fall off, with some probability, with some exponential decay sigma, and exactly as in Teasney, they copy the idea of Teasney of saying, let's decide sigma such that this probability gives an entropy of perplexity 30, so they use the same thing as before. We will notice in a moment that actually it doesn't matter. If you just, because what we now do is we have our weighted k nearest neighbor graph, but you know in high dimensional space, nearest neighbors is a very unclear thing because distances are so similar. If you have 100 cells which are all more or less close to each other, which 20 nearest neighbor you find for a given cell is random. It might be that you just get one read more or less for a gene and then things change a little bit and then another cell is. So a nearest neighbor graph is always sort of a sample of plausible neighborhood relationships. And the cell which doesn't have, and you'll miss out a lot of them. Imagine you were, instead of taking the 20 nearest neighbors, you take all neighbors, all cells up to a certain distance, then you get much more neighbors, and your 20 nearest neighbors are maybe just a sample of them. And this means, in this case, the nearest neighbor gets weight 1, the 21st nearest neighbor, which probably has nearly the same distance, gets weight 0. So the weights cannot be important. So Stamrich and Hamprecht have found out that if you put all the weights to 1 and forget about all this thing, it still works. So they do this thing, they make this directed k nearest neighbor graph where everything is, where we still have this direction of is this A a neighbor of B or vice versa. Put these weights onto this. When they symmetrize the weights, this time not by taking the mean, but taking this thing, which they argue is because it's probabilities, and if you take probabilities, then you have to add them as subtract the joint probability because it appears close. You know, this is the usual formula to add the probability of two events. Isn't really the case because these aren't probabilities. So, but in that way, they make the graph symmetric and all the weights symmetric. And in the end, if we just take our symmetrized k nearest neighbor graph and keep everything on 1, it works as well. So this is the neighborhood relation in Spitzer space. We just take the 20 nearest neighbor and we put some weights onto it, which all don't really matter. And this is the neighborhood relation in on the embedding space on our 2D surface. And you might think, what is this strange thing? But if you look closely, it has two hyperparameters, A and B, which the user defines. But if you look closely, if you remove the A and B, you just see 1 over 1 plus D squared. That's again our T distribution with 1 degree of freedom. So what we've done here is that they copied from Teasney the idea of using this T distribution, and I thought in order to get a little bit of more freedom, let's add a scaling factor here in front of the distance, and let's add a scaling factor here at that thing. Just to squeeze it a bit, sort of acknowledging that it isn't a probability distribution anyway, but just some whatever. And they just use for A and B 2 values which make it look nice. And then again we can calculate as a potential where we add the logarithm of this thing, yes, an equal sign missing, where we take the logarithm of this thing to see how much attractive force I have between a point I and its neighbor J, and we do this all for all neighbor pairs. If we use the original humor, we have to multiply this with our weight here, this strange thing, or what they actually do is, but then if we just say either it's a neighbor or not, then if it's a neighbor, then we use this thing to calculate an attractive force, and if we are not a neighbor, we use 1 minus this thing and use this as a repulsive force. They always put a log in front, turn this likelihood into a log likelihood. So this is the repulsive potential, log 1 minus u, and this is the attractive potential, minus log u. And we take the gradient of these things, and then we get our forces and we move them according to these forces. And here I've now shown you first how this thing here looks like. And with a normal x-axis, you see it falls off like this. And to make it easier, see, I made the x-axis logarithmic here, and then you can see this attractive potential sort of, no, the blue one is the attractive potential, makes the points get attracted to each other until you reach this value here, and then there's hardly any force left, and it more or less stays here. While the orange thing is the repulsive thing, so it makes sure that everything which is not a neighbor tends to be at least that far away, and everything which is a neighbor tends to be around here. And what you do, if you call UMAP, it has two parameters called min-dist and spread. Min-dist is this value here, where the thing has fallen off to, where the thing is down to, I think, 1% of a maximum value. And spread is here when this thing has reached 1 over E or something like that. And with these two things, it simply calculates from the min-dist and spread, it calculates these 2 points, and everybody sticks to the default. Min-dist is 0.1 and spread is 1, and then you get these values for A and B and this curve here. So, what it then does is, it does the following iteration. It goes through all the pairs through all neighbor pairs ij, and the pair gets sampled with its probability Pij. So if a pair is not neighboring, then Pij is 0, so we just skip the pair. If they are neighboring, then Pij is not 0, so we look at them, and we skip them only with probability 1 minus P, and with probability P we keep them. In the implementation that I will show you in a moment, I set P to 1 for all the neighbors, so I always keep the neighbors. And then I push Yi towards its neighbor Yj according to the attractive potential. And then to get the repulsion, how Yi is repulsed by all the non-neighbors, I randomly sample 5 other points, or m other points, but m is set to 5 by default, and calculate the repulsive potential from that. And as you see, the repulsive and the attractive potential were in the same order of magnitude. So essentially this means that the attraction is much stronger than the repulsion, because the cell gets attraction from all the cells, but repulsion it only sees from 5 cells out of the whole UMAP, the whole 20,000 cells. So this means the attractive vision is overweighted corresponding to the repulsion. That's the point that Damrich and Hambrecht do, that the UMAP paper isn't at all clear. They pretend that they calculate the repulsion for all pairs of non-neighbors, but in reality we do it only for a small sample, which means we have a way stronger attraction than repulsion, and that is the real reason why everything is pulled closer together in UMAP than in t-SNE. If you increase this value m, then the UMAP starts looking like t-SNE. So I wanted to implement this myself. So what I've done is, now I'm nearly running out of time, but I can quickly go through this anyway. Query. No, let's not do it live now. I said, okay, I take again my thing, make this nearest neighbor matrix, that we've always done. My cell 1 is neighboring these 20 cells, cell 2 is neighboring these, etc. And I push the whole thing to a GPU because I want to do a gradient descent. And I get this edge list of neighboring cells according to the attraction graph. And then I did my embedding. And to start off my thing, I just randomly spread the cells over my plotting surface using here a normal distribution. And as you can see is, I quickly need to still query 58 13247 13247. Let me see if this opens up, because auto encoder simply come up. Here we go. Oh, that's the right one. So forgive me if I do 10 minutes more, but this is, looks nice. I even made a little animation, so I have to show this off now. So here I do this, and now the way how my calculation works, as I show this here for one thing, I make a mini batch of edges, 30,000 edges of all these 200,000 edges of my neighborhood graph. In the UMAP implementation, they go edge by edge, but I take 30,000 edges in one go because I want to run it on a GPU, so I want to be able to do some kind of parallel working. And I do not always, so I permute all the edges and take the first 30,000 permuted edges. And then I calculate the distance of, then I calculate the distance between, for each edge I calculate the distance between one cell and the other cell of this neighbor part in feature space, and of course in real space. In features, and this here is now the calculation on embedding space where I calculate the difference, and then I get here all the distances, how close the neighbors are here. And I don't look anymore at all at the distances in feature space. I have my neighborhood graph, that's all I know. UMAP doesn't look at anything else except for the neighborhood graph. So I calculated here the distance between all pairs of neighboring points in embedding space. And then I put this into my formula here. You see the one with 1 over 1 plus d squared, plus by hyperparameters, and I get my attractive loss. So this is the potential with minus log 1 over 1 plus d squared, or 1 plus a times d squared times b. And for the repulsive part, I now choose for each of these cells, I first have to choose one edge for which I want to calculate the repulsion. For each edge, I take either the first or the second to calculate the repulsion. So I decide this randomly and pick them out. So I pick here randomly one of the other two, and I get this thing here. And then I find for each of these values 5 neighboring values, which I pick completely at random from all the points. It could be that I randomly happen to catch a neighbor, but that's unlikely, so I don't care about this. And with this, I now get this repulsion. And I put this into my formula, this time with a 1 minus. I add the attraction of the repulsion up. And now I get my total potential and can take the gradient of this. And here's the whole thing put together, starting with a random embedding, giving the embedding to the optimizer, because this is what I want to act the gradient in. And then here I have done my edge permutation, and for each slice of 30,000 edges, I do what I've just shown you, calculate the loss, calculate the gradient of the loss, and step the optimizer. And here I have put every 100 iteration, I draw the UMAP how it looks like this. That's what I'm especially proud, because I hadn't seen this before. So let's start here with stop. Stop. So, and here for comparison, this is what I got last time. Yeah, I just have to. Yeah, this is already after 50 iterations, it sort of moves in, and then now you can here really see how it moves. Now these two ends here have met each other and met in the middle. Now you see here this purple thing, and now it already looks quite well like the UMAP that we had before. Maybe I show you the beginning again quickly. The very first steps. Now I make it that it makes a point for every little step. First step, 10th, 11th, 12th, and you can really see how the neighborhoods get pushed together because of the attractive force between neighbors, and the fact that each neighbor is only a sample of the nearby cells doesn't matter, because the cells pull each other into the neighborhoods of their neighbors. And now this is 65th, 66th iteration, so now it gets a bit annoying, so I switch again to telling it only show 1 every 30, so that you can more easily see what's happening. And in the end, the whole thing doesn't really look like the original UMAP. And yesterday I played around a bit with this thing and I noticed there's a lot of, for example, how big I make the mini batch if I calculate the gradient for 3,000 edges or 10,000 or 100,000 edges at a go. That changes how the UMAP looks at the end, because it's, how I move things around, what the learning rate is in my optimizer. All these things change a bit, so the fact that UMAPs can look so different is a lot on how you do the gradient update. But the general idea is now very clear. For the UMAP, we just have a potential which pulls all the neighboring cells according to the adjacency matrix to this distance and pushes all the non-neighboring cells that far away, and that then gets an equilibrium which turns out to look useful. So that's all I wanted to show you for this finishing part, and you can run the code yourself if you want to, but run it on the machine with GPU. And yeah, now term is ending, so lecture is also ending. I sort of ended the circle by now showing you how the UMAP works, at which we have been looking from the beginning. I hope you liked the lecture. I hope you learned something, and you might have noticed my goal was on the one hand to get you interested in this field of single cell biology. I'm a bit dissatisfied that I didn't manage to bring more biology so that you see how it looks in the application, but for math standards that probably already was a lot of application because we worked with real data. If you're interested to look more into these things, want to make a project practical or whatsoever, or an internship, we always have positions for this, especially there is a big need in biology, at least in my opinion, for mathematically trained people. As you can imagine, working with such stuff, you need somebody who is willing to, who knows the biology and the math or computer science. So you need somebody with skills in math, in computer science, and in biology. And ideally also a bit in physics, because I would like to claim what we are doing here is physics, because physics is in my opinion, I define physics as the art of using math to understand nature. And if you use math in biology, you're a physicist. This is, of course, a way of me to explain why we physicists belong here. But it might also appear, now we have no physicists here, but if you as a mathematician, you now try to apply your math to actual stuff out there, actual nature, you become an honorary physicist, so maybe you want to follow this path. In that case, talk to me. I can maybe give you a business advice because I've also done this jump into biology. If you just want to try it out, do this. Ask for an internship. And very importantly, if you might be interested in doing a master thesis or maybe even a PhD in areas like this, there's a lot of work to be done because a lot of stuff gets laid behind that even groups like a research group like ours, which have a strong direction of mathematics, we mainly have access to biology students. And nothing wrong with biology students, but of course the biology curriculum doesn't educate people in mathematical thinking. So this kind of doing this kind of stuff, applying these methods and looking at your data is something for the biologists, but developing these methods, refining them, thinking about whether we can replace them with something better, it's an originary task for people with computational training, i.e. mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists. And this not only applies to biology, but to all areas where you use advanced mathematics to do research on actual real data, even to financial quant math, even though I'm not sure that is real data. So this is probably more real. And yeah, at least in my feeling, maybe it has changed, probably rather not, but I have a feeling this is a perspective that is not shown very much in a typical math education. So that's what I want to do. If you feel that there is a point in applied math, and if you believe me that applied math is not dirty, try to go there and find some nice area where math is applied. And I can say biology is a very nice area to work as an applied mathematician, or even better, as a physicist. Because you become a physicist once you do that. So that was sort of a wrap-up. And with that, I want to finish, let you go into the term break. And again, I hope you found this interesting.